So we have a few learning objectives to cover today. The first one is that at the end of this presentation, I would like for you to develop your competence in identifying when a child is experiencing the effects of trauma. I would like for you to be able to put plans in place that support children with trauma backgrounds. I would like for you to feel confident in creating classroom spaces that support regulation. I would like for you to develop the language to help children understand their big feelings. And finally, and most importantly, is to focus on the brain and not blame the behaviour of these children. So, what is trauma? I want you to spend a few moments to think about what is your understanding of trauma at the moment. I'll give it a wee pause for about 20 seconds so that you can get some ideas going in your head. So as you can see on the slide, I have a number of images that represent, or maybe represent, some of the ideas that you came up with when you were thinking of trauma. So trauma can include natural disasters, things like the Christchurch earthquake. We've seen a rise in the number of children who are experiencing anxiety, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder after the earthquake. Things like bushfires in Australia, floods, tsunamis, any kind of naturally occurring disaster. It also includes war. We may have a number of children in our centres that are from refugee backgrounds, and war can be hugely traumatic for children. Trauma can also include things like car accidents, things that might seem minor for an adult can be very significant for children. Also significant car accidents where family members are hurt, injured, and the like. Family violence is a really common source of trauma, as is neglect, and even things like medical procedures. So having some vaccinations or breaking an arm and having to have surgery, those can be sources of trauma. So what is trauma? We're going to look at some definitions here. So the first one talks about that individual trauma can result from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Okay, so that's a lot of quite big words and big concepts there, but what it boils down to is that trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope. So what that really means, what it boils down to, is that something that can induce a trauma response one day might have been tolerated if it happened 6 months down the track when things were a little bit more calm for a child. So it's about what is going on for that child and how resilient are they to the adverse experiences they're having. Because we don't know what the final drop is that lands in the bucket that overflows, that fills that child's bucket of coping. The final point on the slide is that a child can be taken out of the trauma, but it's not easy to take the trauma out of the child. So it's not as easy as changing the environment. The trauma is taken care of, it's done, it's over, that child is fine. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, and that trauma can stay with a child for their entire lifetime. So on the slide we've got an example or an explanation of the different types of trauma that people can experience. So the first type of trauma we've got there is called acute trauma, and this results from a single incident. So this might be a natural disaster, a car accident, death of a family member or someone close to the child. So it's a one-off incident. We also have things like something called chronic trauma, and this is repeated and prolonged exposure to something that overwhelms a child's ability to cope. So this was where you'd see the effects of war or ongoing abuse. So something that happens repeatedly and that the child cannot escape. What we have next is the complex trauma. So complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive and interpersonal nature. So unfortunately, a lot of children end up drawing the short straw, and they might experience a car accident, and then following that they might experience incapacitation or death of a family member as a result of that car accident, and then that person might have been the breadwinner, so the family goes into a state of poverty, and then so there's the trauma of a loss of not only the loss of their family member, but the loss of their life as they knew it. So those things are referred to as complex trauma. We also have intergenerational trauma, which is where the past generations have experienced trauma, and then they pass on that trauma by the way that they parent their children. So their behaviour has an impact on their children. And then we have something called transgenerational trauma, which is really quite interesting because the trauma experienced by one generation actually changes the genetic expression of the following generation. So we'll go into that in a lot more detail a bit further on in the presentation, but really interesting, and it shows that we can't just use a blanket term of trauma and have a really clear understanding of what that child has experienced. There's huge diversity in experiences of trauma. Something that goes hand in hand with understanding the effects of trauma is understanding something called the adverse childhood experiences, or commonly referred to as ACEs. Some of you might have heard of ACEs, and for some of you it might be a new term, but I hope that you'll become really familiar with it and confident in understanding what ACEs are. So ACEs are significant childhood traumas which can result in actual physical changes in brain development. So these changes may affect a child's learning ability, their social skills, and can result in long-term health problems. You might be wondering how exposure to adverse childhood experiences can create long-term health outcomes. And what happens in our bodies, we've got this incredible thing called the stress response. So you might have heard of it as the flight or fight response. So what that stress response does is when it detects a threat in our environment, such as this big scary bear, it sets off our protective brain, our amygdala, our limbic system. It tells us that we're under threat, and what we need to do is we need to fight. So it sends a surge of blood and oxygen to our muscles to get us ready to fight or to run away, and it also causes our thinking brain to leave the premises for a little while, because it's no use standing in front of this threat and thinking about all of our options. We need to act quickly. And also what it does is the stress response releases some hormones, some transmitters that trigger our immune response. So that, for example, if we get bitten by this big scary bear, that our immune response can help keep us safe, it can help fight off infection. But what our stress response is not designed for is this big scary bear coming home every night. So if this threat is ongoing, constant, inescapable, our stress response is activated in a way that it's not designed to be. So our flight or fight response is constantly activated, which means we're not engaging in our thinking brain enough, and our immune response becomes hyper activated, which means that we have our body is not as well capable of fighting off infections, of managing its typical immune responses, because it's hyper aroused. So what happens here is that we have long-term activation of our stress response, therefore long-term activation of our immune response, which actually is not very good for our health. So these adverse childhood experiences, there are 10 experiences that this study has looked at. So it looks at abuse in the forms of physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Neglect in the form of physical neglect and emotional neglect. And the final category is household dysfunction, which looks at, is there a member of the family that has a mental illness? Is there an immediate family member who has been incarcerated? Was the mother of the child treated violently? Are there substance abuse issues in the home? And has the child's parents been divorced or separated by death even? And what we see is that exposure to childhood ACEs, so exposure to those adverse childhood experiences, can increase the risk of all of these things listed here. So adolescent pregnancy, alcoholism and alcohol abuse, health problems such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, mental health issues such as depression, engagement in risky behaviours such as early initiation of sexual activity, early initiation of smoking, increases the chances of losing your child while pregnant. It increases the chances of illicit drug use, ischemic heart disease, liver disease, the risk for intimate partner violence, suicide attempts, and unintended pregnancies. So this is a slide that just shows a visual representation of how common are ACEs. So if you can see this here is the number of people who have 0 ACEs, so 36% of the population, which is just over a third of the population, will have 0. 26% of the population will have 1. 16% of the population will have 2. 9.5% of the population will have 3. And 12.5% of the population will have 4 or more. And it's important to point out here that this study has been replicated in a huge number of countries, across ethnicities, across socioeconomic groups. This is not isolated to one portion of the population. This is a standard representation of the numbers across all studies, across ethnicity, race, socioeconomic standing. So this is, these are not unusual numbers. These will be representative of our population as well. This graphic here talks about the number of people who have at least 1 ACE. It gives some indication of, again, the statistics. So 1/8 of the population have more than 4 ACEs. And here, people with 4 or more ACEs are 3 times as likely to develop lung disease and engage in smoking. They're 14 times more likely to attempt suicide. They're 4.5 times more likely to develop depression. 11 times more likely to use intravenous drugs and abuse them. And they're twice as likely to suffer from liver disease. Okay, so these are really significant issues, not just in terms of behaviour, mental health and physical health. This is across the spectrum of these children's lives. This is going to impact them. So this is a bit of an extreme example and might be quite confronting for some of you. If you or somebody has an ACE score of 6, they have a 20-year less life expectancy, so they will live for 20 years less than the average person. They're 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. They're twice as likely to suffer from cancer, strokes and heart disease. Twice as likely to be a smoker. And 4 times as likely to suffer from depression. So I hope that you're not sitting there thinking this is all doom and gloom, that these ACEs are essentially a life sentence. They're not, but it's very important that we are aware of the risk that the exposure to these ACEs can put our children at. So this reiterates that point, sorry. ACEs put a child at risk, but they don't have to be a life sentence. The presence of ACEs does not mean that a child will experience poor outcomes. Children's positive experiences or protective factors can protect the children against the effects of adversity and can protect against many of the negative health and life outcomes even after adversity has occurred. This is what's called resilience. And you'll be really pleased to know that participation in early childhood education with quality relationships with teachers can be a really strong protective factor for our kids, because it's very well known that relationships protect against adversity. Okay, I'm just going to give a wee pause there to have a good think about that statement. Relationships protect against adversity. So think about your role, your interactions with the children, and the importance of you in those children's lives and that relationship that you build with those children. So you might be wondering, man, like this is all really important stuff to know, but how do I know if the child in front of me is experiencing trauma or are they just a naughty kid? Okay, so this is what it might look like in the classroom. I've often heard teachers saying, oh, there's nothing happened, there were no triggers, he just goes from 0 to 100, with the click of a fingers. You might have said that yourself. Yes, then you go, oh, I've said that. They might be frequently heightened, okay? So they always seem to be on edge, perhaps very rarely appear to be calm, perhaps always flitting around to different activities, not really engaging in anything, just really unsettled. They might also, the opposite of that, they might appear withdrawn, even daydreaming. So maybe they appear like they're away with the fairies a lot of the time. You try and call their name and they don't respond because they're in their own little world. They might be aggressive. So that child that is throwing the chairs, is responding to frustration by hitting out, that could be a child that's experiencing trauma. They could have delayed development, so their speech might be delayed, their motor skills are not what you'd expect for a child of their age, their communication strategies, their social skills, their fine motor skills, just general delay in development. You might see moments of regression to earlier stages of development. So perhaps they've got quite good speech, but then sometimes when they are heightened or, looking frustrated, angry, they start babbling and you can't understand what they're saying. Or you might see instances of, a child wetting themselves when they were previously toilet trained. So you might see regression to earlier stages of development. It might look like a lack of self-regulation, so the child can't calm themselves down, so they become, something sets them off and they can't calm down like you would expect them to. Or you might see some problematic attempts at self-regulation, so you might see something like head banging, or another inappropriate way of regulating themselves. You might see academic, cognitive or learning delays. So they're not picking up concepts like the other children. They seem to find real difficulty in grasping numbers, or they can't seem to learn the letters of their name like the other children. So that might be enough to just trigger off some curiosities in you that what's going on for this child. They may have attentional issues. So this is a very common one that children with trauma backgrounds are often diagnosed with ADHD. They can't seem to sit still. They can't seem to focus on anything. They're all over the place. They're into everything, but not really engaging with anything. So that's also a common symptom. They may have difficulty following instructions, especially multi-step instructions. Go to the kitchen, get this, take it there, and then do this with it. You've probably lost them already. So those children that you would expect in terms of their age would be able to follow a multi-step instruction. If they're really struggling to do that, it's another reason to question what's going on for this child. Delayed grasp of abstract concepts. So things like time, rules of a game, social rules, even numbers, they can be quite abstract concepts and really difficult for a child who is a little bit stuck in terms of their cognitive development to grasp those concepts. So taking from the concrete to the abstract is really quite difficult. And they might have poor executive functioning. So executive functioning is our decision making, our inhibition, that little voice inside us that says, that's not a good idea, you better not do that. That can be impaired. So children that appear impulsive, that can't delay gratification, that seem to not be able to weigh up decisions properly, that might be a child that's experiencing trauma, because those are quite advanced cognitive abilities, and they're only allowed to flourish and gain strength when the child is safe and regulated, which unfortunately children who have experienced trauma do not have the ability to be safe and regulated enough that they can really develop strong executive functioning skills. So now we've got a little diagram about the brain. I'm going to teach you a little bit about how the brain develops, not in too much scientific detail, but what you do need to know is that the brain develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. So what we have here is our survival brain. So this is our brain stem, which also referred to as reptilian brain. This is responsible for keeping us alive, for our breathing, our heart rate, regulation of our body temperature. Then we have our limbic system, which is referred to as our mammalian brain. So that is our emotional brain as well, and that's what detects our amygdala, which is in here, is our smoke alarm, our stress detector of the brain, and that's what lets us know if we're under threat or in danger, and that's what activates our stress response. And up here, the last to develop, is our cortex, and our particular prefrontal cortex. This is our smart brain. Okay, so the structures that keep us safe develop first, and the ones that allow us to think develop last. And a really nice way of understanding how the brain works is if you follow this hand model of the brain. So if you hold up your hand, like shown in the diagram here, and you tuck your thumb into your palm, you can consider that your wrist is your brainstem. So that, if you recall, that was the part of the brain that's responsible for breathing, for regulating body temperature, regulating heart rate, all of those core survival functions. The thumb, which is now tucked into your palm, is the limbic region. So remember, that was the mammalian brain, the part of your brain responsible for detecting threats. Okay, so one that's like, oh, that's a bit scary, stress response. Your fingers are your cerebrum, the cortex, okay? And if you tuck them over your thumb, like it's happening in this diagram, you've got now a nice little fist where your limbic system is tucked in there, your cortex is over the top of it. That's called the hand model of our brain, okay? So our brain is constantly in communication, everything is working nicely. This is a brain that is safe, not under threat. What happens is when our stress response is triggered, by a threat in our environment, our cortex does not receive as much energy, okay? So, and it's also not helpful for us when we're under threat to be thinking a lot. So what happens is if you lift your fingers up, we flip our lid. So that means that our logical brain, our thinking brain, or what's commonly referred to as the upstairs brain, it's no longer engaged. What is controlling our behaviour is our survival brain. Okay, so what happens is that this is when all the energy runs to our muscles. We do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe, and that's referred to as flipping your lid. Okay, so the upper and lower parts of the brain are no longer connected. Okay, they're no longer talking to each other. Our logic, our thinking, no longer influences our emotions. Okay, they've disconnected from each other. We're acting on emotions and survival only. So you might be starting to see why this can be problematic, especially in the classroom. And what happens is that the brain develops in a use-dependent way. So the more that we detect threats in our environment, the more that we flip our lid, the more likely we are to detect threats in our environment. So what happens is that we get a sensitized stress response. So we start to see threats everywhere. So we start to interpret neutral facial expressions as a threat. We start to interpret a slightly raised voice as a threat, a body stance that's, might look intimidating, and that is enough to set off our stress response. And that causes us to become dysregulated. Okay, when you're well regulated, your thinking brain is engaged, and you can make the most of all parts of your brain. When you are dysregulated, your body, your brain thinks that you are under threat, and you cannot use your thinking brain. The survival brain takes over, the smart brain disengages. And also it's important to know that when the survival brain is in charge, the non-verbal cues reign supreme, okay? Unfortunately, our use of language is largely in our cortex. So when our cortex flips, when we flip our lid, we can't access language in the same way. So you might be trying to talk to a child, they can't process what you're saying. You might have an idea in your head of when you can think of a child's flipped their lid and they couldn't seem to talk to you, okay? That's because language is contained in the cortex. And unfortunately, threat detected through non-verbal cues is detected readily. So you have to be very aware of what you're doing with your body, with your tone, with your face, when a child has flipped their lid, because they are perceiving threat even if it's not there. So I'll give you a few moments to read through some of the information here to really solidify that understanding of the hand model of the brain. Okay, so what happens to a traumatized brain? What we have here is an image of, this is called an MRI, of 2 3-year-old children. It's a very commonly used image by Dr. Bruce Perry. On the left here, we have an MRI of a typically developing 3-year-old child who has grown up in a nurturing environment. Okay, on the right is the brain of a 3-year-old Romanian orphan who had their physical needs met in the orphanage, so they were fed and changed, but they were neglected in terms of their emotional development. Okay, and what you can see is that obviously the brain on the right is a lot smaller than the brain on the left. So the actual size of the brain is quite significantly different. And you can also see larger amounts of black space on this brain on the right. And that's because there are fewer neural connections that have been made in this brain. Okay, there's a lot more space that's underutilized. There are fewer connections for this child. And how this happens is that, as I said earlier, that the brain develops in a use-dependent way. So neurons that fire together wire together. So what happens is if we have an overdeveloped stress response, the fight and flight pathways, that part of the brain develops very strongly and is more likely to be activated whenever a threat is detected. So that becomes the dominant pathway for the brain. And we get an underdeveloped neurocortex pathway. So, but if we are detecting stress a lot in our, threat a lot in our environment, we're not allowing connections to be built with our cortex, which is our smart brain. Therefore, it does not develop at the same rate. I hope that makes sense. So this is an example of how early life trauma can stifle development, and it can cause the brain to get stuck in a developmental stage. Okay, it's important to point out that this does not mean that this child has a limited capacity for neural growth. This child, if given the right environment, the right support, can absolutely achieve the cognitive capacities of this child on the left. They just need the right environment to repair. That's the beautiful thing about the brain, is that it's plastic, especially in the early years. There's great neuroplasticity, which means that it can recover. So this is building on what I was just talking about in terms of opportunities for development. What we often see with children who are growing up is that we have our opportunities for learning and development occur through our relationships. This is because relationships in themselves are really rewarding. We are a social species. We would not survive if you take us back to the caveman day. A lone person would not survive very long. We needed other humans to survive. We are pack animals. Okay, and this is the fundamental basis for our brain, is that relationships are rewarding. Children and adults reward each other during the interactions through smiling, laughing, giggling, and this actually releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is our feel-good neurotransmitter. So we learn to associate people with feeling good. Have a think about a child that you've worked with, and that you go over and tell them they've done a great job. Their little face lights up. They're so happy that you've recognized them. Their little smile makes you smile, and you leave that interaction feeling amazing. That child leaves that interaction feeling amazing, and therefore you're more likely to be drawn to that child, right? And so you're more likely to look for the good things in that child and have that experience again. That's human nature. That's how we develop, is those relationships. And what happens? So this is the I guess the child I was just talking about could be represented up here. This is a typically developing child, and this diagram shows the opportunities for learning and development through social interactions throughout one day. Okay, this is, if you can make out this, I realise the photo is not very good quality, but this is 6 a.m. So when the child's waking up, presumably. This is midday, 12 p.m. This is 6 p.m. and this is midnight. Okay, so it's a clock. If we look at this like a clock, the closest circle here, the smaller circle, that is positive interactions with family. If we look to the wider circle, this is interactions with peers. The bigger one is with teachers, school staff, and this is just in the community in general. Okay, so you can see that this is a child getting a huge amount of positive interactions from various sources throughout their day. Lots from their parents, lots from their friends and peers, lots from their teachers. What happens is children from trauma backgrounds often do not have early experience of the rewarding nature of relationships, and therefore they don't exhibit behaviours that draw adults or peers towards them and maintain them. So if we think about that example that I said, that you go up to a child and you tell them they've done a good job, if that child does not even look at you, does not respond to you, doesn't smile at you, or worse, if they, tell you to F off, or, some other negative reaction, this is going to change your behaviour. You're not going to get a surge of dopamine from that interaction, and you're less likely to be drawn towards them in the future. Okay, don't beat yourself up about it. This is human nature. Okay, that dopamine response up here, that makes us feel good and makes us repeat whatever we did to get that good feeling. If we don't get that, we're less likely to repeat that behaviour again. But what happens for that child is that it reduces the opportunities for positive engagement, because they're not drawing other people towards them, because they don't find interactions rewarding, because they did not have that experience when they were younger. They don't allow for those interactions to take on a rewarding nature. So this reduces the opportunities for positive engagement, and therefore reinforcing the cycle of a poverty of relationships and underdeveloped neural pathways. This is quite a sad and quite shocking, I think, comparison. So if we remember that this inner circle was interactions with family, interactions with peers, interactions with teachers, and the community. Okay, you might see here that there's none with the peers. So these are the children that do not know how to interact in a socially appropriate way with their peers. Their behaviour pushes their peers away, and they don't get to do the important social learning. We do have some positive things going on with the parents here, not nearly as many as this child had. And look, 4 with their teachers versus all of these. So you think about in terms of which child really needs the most opportunities, in terms of, you think that those neurons that fire together, wire together, we're looking to build neural pathways. This child is getting ample opportunities. This child's getting very, very few. Okay, so we're going to keep this in mind when you've got that child who's pushing back, who seems to hate it whenever you go up to them. That is the child that you need to invest in terms of building that relationship. Okay, we're going to go a bit sciencey now. I hope you can stay with me here. Trauma has a genetic imprint. So we talked earlier about transgenerational versus intergenerational trauma, and Diaz and Ressler studied the epigenetic properties of trauma. So what they did is they conditioned a mouse to be afraid of a previously neutral smell. So then the mouse then developed new neural pathways that they passed on to future generations of mice through a process called epigenetics. So the following generations of mice were also afraid of the smell, despite never being exposed to the smell. So this down here is a video. I don't think we can watch it together, but it goes into more detail about this process of epigenetics. So I encourage you to watch this after you finish this presentation. But what it does is it shows us how the trauma of a previous generation can actually impact the genetic presentation of future generations. So in this study, mice, they were exposed to a smell of peppermint, which is not it's a neutral smell for mice, but they conditioned the mouse to be afraid with it by, I think they scared them somehow when they presented the smell of peppermint. So the mouse then associated the smell of peppermint with something bad happening. I think they shocked them perhaps. So then they learned to be afraid of peppermint, and that changed the genetic expression for that mouse. And then the future generations of that mouse, when they had babies, those mice also showed the same fear response to peppermint, despite never having smelt peppermint before. So it's really incredible, and it's shaped our understanding of how trauma can be passed on to our children in a really powerful way. So that's called epigenetics, and I encourage you to spend a bit of time after this presentation to watch that video. It's very interesting. Okay, we're going to move on to what's called regulation. So we have dysregulation and regulation. And children with trauma are hypervigilant to threats in their environment. So they can often become dysregulated, which is when they flip their lids, when they perceive a threat, and often they lack the skills to self-regulate. What I haven't gotten here is that regulation follows a process of development. So we have something called auto-regulation, which is the things that we would do in the womb as well to regulate. So if you think thumb sucking is a form of auto-regulation, and after auto-regulation comes co-regulation. So before we can self-regulate, we need to have others to help us regulate. That's usually the caregivers and primarily the mother. So the things that you would instinctively do when you pick up a baby that's crying, you rock them. A lot of mums would make a noise and go shh, 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 shh. And what you're doing without even realizing it is you're helping to regulate your child. So that's called co-regulation, when regulation occurs with another person. And only after you have experienced enough repetitions of co-regulation that you've learnt from a consistent caregiver how to co-regulate, then you can develop the skills for self-regulation. But unfortunately, children with trauma backgrounds often do not have that consistent co-regulation, and therefore they can't self-regulate. What's really important to understand in terms of regulation as well is that children or people with trauma also experience something called hostile attribution bias. So that means that they will perceive threats where perhaps there aren't any. So if you show people without trauma a neutral face, they'll identify it as a neutral face, neither positive or negative. If you show that same face to people who've experienced trauma, they will identify that face as being hostile. Okay, so they're more likely to perceive hostility, which then can cause them to become dysregulated, to flip their lid. There are different forms of regulation. There's something called cortical regulation, which is that little voice that can provide reason when you're a little bit uncertain and a little bit fearful. So that, when you're suddenly alone in the dark and you hear a noise, it's that voice in your head that says, it's okay. It's unlikely to be anything too scary, like I know I'm safe. And it's a top-down process, which means it comes from the cortex. But that can only develop if our primary caregiver has regulated our stress response in our early developmental stages. Okay, this is something that you have to have a safe and consistent caregiver to allow you to develop this skill. And there's also something called somatosensory regulation, which is a bottom-up process. If you remember that the cortical regulation came from the cortex down, this somatosensory regulation comes from the brainstem up. Okay, so it starts in our womb with our suck and swallow response, so the thumb sucking, and it's consistent with our experiences intrauterine, okay, and perinatal associations. So the rhythms of the mother's heart rate and the somatosensory regulation tools that are really useful are breathing, walking, running, rocking, things that are rhythmic, humming, swinging, tapping, dancing, anything that has that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic nature to it, okay? So that's the bottom up. So this is the one we're going to be using with most of our children, yet this is the one that we expect them to do. You know, we expect them to be able to reason and calm themselves down through logic, but they can't. They need to be calmed down through their body. It's also important to mention, which I haven't got on the slide, is that this is I guess an assumption of dysregulation in terms of being hyper aroused. So that the up, where it can also occur that the child can be hypo aroused, which is down. You know, those children that are daydreaming, a little bit dissociated, those children might need up regulation. And these somatosensory regulation tools can do that as well. There we go, we've got it back. It's also important to remember that children do not go from 0 to 100 like that, okay? That child was never at 0 to start with. So building in activities to regulate will help your children to calm down. So you might not know their state of dysregulation, or they might be so heightened as their default response that to you that looks like that child you know, being at normal, but they're still heightened, okay? So regulatory activities will be good for all children. So please invest the time in doing these activities throughout the day. Okay, what we have here is an image that represents what's called the window of tolerance. So if you look here at the image, what you have here in the middle is our window of tolerance, and this is our ability to think and feel at the same time, okay? All parts of our brain are engaged, communicating with each other, working effectively. Above this dotted line here, we have what's called hyperarousal, and that's our state of hypervigilance, overly quick or intense reactions, and a feeling of a lack of emotional safety and an overwhelming of emotions. Okay, our stress response has been triggered here. We're not thinking. Our emotional brain and survival brain has taken the wheel. Our thinking brain has gone. Okay. Here is hypoarousal, where we're feeling shut down, flat, disassociated. It's hard to think. Perhaps a real sense of embarrassment, and just can't become engaged and involved. Children will only learn and have meaningful learning experiences while they're in their window of tolerance. Okay, this child, the hypoaroused child, might be easier for us to cope with in the classroom because they're not going around and you know, smashing things up. They're not harming anyone. But it's important to remember that this child is not learning, not just learning their name and numbers. They're not having social, emotional learning opportunities. Okay, they have to be in this window of tolerance. This window of tolerance for a child from a trauma background is much narrower than a child from a safe and predictable background. Okay, so if you cut that in half, that might be the window of tolerance for a child from a trauma background. And this is a good opportunity for you to think about your own window of tolerance and how someone else's behaviour has impacted on your tolerance. Okay, so there's a pretty good graphic, I don't have it here, that we can see the plotting of the window of tolerance for a teacher and a child, and you can see that as the child becomes hyper aroused, so does the teacher. Okay, and you've got to think, can a teacher who is outside of their window of tolerance support a child who is out of theirs? And the answer to that is no. If you are not within your window, you are not going to be a safe, predictable and calm person to be able to help regulate that child. So you're dysregulated, you're not going to be able to co-regulate with them. So what can you do if you've gone outside of your window of tolerance when you're dealing with a child? There's no shame in this. It happens. We're only human. That sometimes children can push us over our edge. So what can you do when you have gone outside of your window? So, some of the techniques that you can use, you can, if possible, ask for, your colleague who's in the room to take over with that child for you, because they're coming in fresh, they're within their window of tolerance, just while you have a few deep breaths and you regulate yourself, okay? As adults, hopefully we have some good self-regulatory skills, and then once you are back in your window, you can re-engage and repair that relationship with that child, okay? And you can help to co-regulate, but just be very aware that if you're operating outside of your window of tolerance, you are not going to be helpful for that child. You need to be regulated first. We have another image here, which is escalation cycle, which is also really important to understand. So it's got phases of acting out behaviour and intensity over time. And what's important to know is that children accelerate through the escalation cycle at different rates. So some children might go like way up really quickly, where some might have a more prolonged period of becoming agitated and acceleration, and the peak might be really short. Or some children, their peak might last for ages. So everyone cycles through this really differently, but all children will go through this escalation cycle, all these stages. It's just a matter of plotting out what it looks like for that particular child. What I really want to draw your attention to is the fact that the distance between de-escalation, so here we've got calm, everything's good, there's a trigger, so they start to become heightened, their behaviour becomes more intense. They're becoming agitated, even more intense. It's accelerating, so they're starting to become dysregulated. And this is the peak, so this is when the behaviour is at its absolute worst. And then we've got the calm down period and recovery. What happens here is if you intervene too soon, before the child is in recovery, the distance between de-escalation and acceleration is very short, okay? You can very easily re-trigger a child at this point and they'll just zoom straight back into acceleration. And you can get quite easily trapped into this pattern of behaviour. So when you're planning, you need to be mindful of the escalation cycle for the individual child and what you can do at each stage of the cycle. So what does the child's behaviour look like when they're calm? How do you know they're calm, and what can you do to maintain calm? What are the known triggers for that child? What sets them off? And think about all the senses if you can, because often we look for things that we can see, but often triggers are things that the children might smell. It can be a noise that they hear that reminds them of something that's happened to them. What does it look like when a child's becoming agitated? How do we know they've gone from calm to agitated? What is their body doing? What kind of things do they say? What does their behaviour look like? And then what can you do at this point to get them back to calm? What does it look like when we're really accelerating? What does their behaviour look like now? What are they doing now? How and what can you do at this point to stop us from moving to peak and to move back down the cycle? When their behaviour's at their peak, how long does it last usually? What do they do? What's the worst that can happen? What does it look like? Okay, and what can you do now to keep that child and other children safe? This is kind of your safety planning. Ideally, we would have really effective interventions that make this less likely, but you still have to plan for this. What are you going to do if the behaviour peaks? A very clear de-escalation plan. So usually it's do not intervene until you know the child is in recovery. And how do you know they're in recovery? What does that look like? How do you know that a child has truly recovered, they're calm again? Does it look like this? You know, what do they say? What does their body look like? How do they hold themselves? So having really clear examples and descriptions of what it looks like will help you know. Okay, I suggested a child that is still very tense in their body, so still perhaps got their hands in fists, sticking their fingers into their hands, still have their shoulders very tense, who are still holding their face in a certain way, are still in this stage. You've got to think about what it looks like for that child when they're in recovery, and that might be different for every child. So what works for children with trauma in the classroom? You'll be pleased to know that the most important thing is having strong relationships with adults, okay? So safe, predictable, consistent relationships are absolutely key. A predictable routine supported by a visual timetable with warning for changes, okay? If the child knows what's coming, they can prepare themselves and you can help to prepare them too. It's when we have a lot of changes and inconsistencies that the child's more likely to become triggered because you're introducing unknown quantities into the environment. Lots of opportunities for repetition. So if you think about the neural pathways and how children with trauma backgrounds have not had as many opportunities to form the pathways to the cortex, it might take more opportunities for repetition for them to learn and to internalize information than children who come from safer, more predictable backgrounds. So don't get frustrated. Give them lots of opportunities for repetition. Plan for intentional regulatory activities and preferably multisensory ones, okay? Don't wait till the child has become dysregulated. Keep using regulatory activities throughout the day. You're probably doing it already. Just think about how you can maximize those activities to get the most bang for your buck in terms of what other senses can you engage. Perhaps, if you're playing with Play-Doh, can you put a nice scented lavender in the Play-Doh, because that's known as a scent that can have a calming influence, okay? So how can you make it even more multi-sensory? Having clear boundaries and consequences, okay? They are important. I'm not telling you let a child with trauma to get away with everything, but those consequences should be naturally occurring. So if a child has in a state of flipping the lid and being dysregulated, if they've broken things in the classroom or messed up the classroom, when they are in recovery, when they have calmed down, then you can, once you have connected and talked with the child and built that connection, then you can correct by helping them to clean up a naturally occurring consequence, okay? It's likely that child is experiencing real sense of shame, so we want to maintain their mana, okay? That's why the connection before correction is really important. So you're not shaming them. They feel bad enough about what they've done. Probably they don't need you to tell them how stupid it was. And also, you need to think about the timing of consequences. Remember that time is quite an abstract concept, and children with trauma can struggle to grasp those abstract concepts. If you give them a consequence that is too distanced from the behaviour, they're not going to make that connection that I'm missing out on this because I did something bad a week ago. I can't go on the trip on the holidays because I was naughty 2 months ago. Okay, it does not work like that. But at the same time, do not be so immediate that you intervene before the child has calmed down, because you'll just re-escalate them, re-trigger them. So consequences should happen as soon as safely possible after the behaviour. Support the child to regulate when they're dysregulated, so use that co-regulation. They need you, okay? And sometimes, even though a child might be 4 years old, you might use a strategy that you use on a much younger child, because remember about that digression to earlier stages of development. Okay, so their brain might need a strategy for a younger child. So maybe, like perhaps giving them a little cuddle and rocking them might actually be a really effective strategy to help them regulate. Slow yourself down, talk slower, use a lower pitch for your voice. Don't use complex sentences, and don't use lots of body movements when a child is dysregulated, okay? So less is more in terms of the way that you speak, and remember that they're going to interpret those non-verbal cues more than the verbal cues, and so things like the tone of your voice is going to be interpreted more than what you're actually saying. If you're using lots of body movements, we're a lot bigger than the children, so that can be seen as threatening for them. That maybe you're not predictable with what you're doing with your body, and that can be quite scary. And the most important thing down here is connection before correction, okay? So they need to know from you that your relationship is okay. They have not broken the relationship with you. They're not a bad child, but their behavior was not okay. So are you all right? That was a bit scary, that behavior. I hope you're okay. Can you tell me about why you did that? Or can you help me understand what it was that made you feel so scared? Okay, so really connect with them before you correct them. So what doesn't work so well? Unfortunately, our token economies, which is our star charts, they don't work well. Again, it's because they're quite abstract. They rely on something happening in the future. The stars stand in for something, an abstract concept. If a child does not access the reinforcer, it can be very punishing. So they're generally not a useful strategy for children from trauma backgrounds. Unpredictable environments can be really challenging for kids with trauma backgrounds. So if you think about our children with trauma being hypervigilant anyway, if you then add an element of unpredictability, it's going to make them more hypervigilant. Okay, it's going to put them even more on edge. Like I mentioned before, lots of talking, particularly during times of dysregulation. Don't talk so much. I'm doing a terrible modelling of that at the moment. I'm talking a lot. Multi-step instructions. So keep your instructions simple. It's quite difficult to hold too many things in memory, particularly if you are kind of in a heightened state of alertness. You can't hold all of those things in mind at once. Watch the tone and speed of your voice and your words. So these children are hypersensitive to facial expressions, the volume of your voice, the tone, etc. They pick up on stress-related behaviours of adults, and like we discussed earlier, they exhibit a hostile attribution bias. Okay, so they will find hostility and danger where there's not. What also doesn't work is if the adults become dysregulated. So you need to make sure you take deep breaths yourself to calm yourself down, and then your student's more likely to imitate you. If you become really dysregulated and stressed, they are more likely to do that too. It's that contagion of affect, okay? Stress is contagious, and calmness is also contagious. So think about what you are modelling for the child. So at the start of the presentation, we had some specific learning objectives that we wanted to cover. The first one was develop competence in identifying when a child is experiencing the effects of trauma. So what are some signs a child might be experiencing a trauma response? And we've got a list here. So an inability to focus, so those with those attentional issues. Deep withdrawal, so that was the child that appears to be daydreaming a lot and in their own little world. Children who are very wary, suspicious, not trusting. Children who lack that executive functioning, so that impulse control. An inability to sit still. So some repetitive behaviours. So are they trying to regulate themselves? What are they doing there? If they appear anxious, so twirling hair, sucking thumb. If they appear overly clingy or needy. If they are talking about they've got pains and complaints, so sore tummies a lot. If they seem to have a lack of boundaries, so really affectionate with strangers. Are they overreaction to peer movement? So are they interpreting the actions of others as being potentially harmful for them? Extremely acute awareness of any negative body language, so that hostile attribution bias. Misinterpretation of events, so where a child feels that their actions have caused the problem. We know that children are very egocentric, so they're very intuitive when they know something's going wrong, but they're not very good at identifying why. So they will attribute that they're the cause of the problem. Okay. Explosive behaviour that does not have a clear cause, so that's triggered. You're not sure what triggered it, but they were fine, and then all of a sudden they appeared not to be fine. Trouble with transitions, so yeah, those changes, moving into a different room, changing between activities. Difficulties adjusting to changes in schedules, and avoidant behaviour, so not wanting to go somewhere, refusing to participate or go certain places. Our second learning objective was to be able to put plans in place that support children with trauma backgrounds. I beg you, really, that your IDPs must consider a child's trauma background. When you're planning, you need to allow space for activities that regulate. So rhythmic, repetitive, multi-sensory activities are best. Remember that relationships are critically important. So predictable, reliable, helpful adults who can meet the child's needs are absolutely essential. And the adults must be able to regulate themselves, okay? You need to be calm in order to be able to calm someone else. So we talked about connection before correction, and here's another key takeaway message is first regulate, then relate, and then reason. So here we've got it as well. So the regulators, we must help the child to regulate and calm their fight, flight, freeze response. Then we need to relate. So we must relate and connect with the child through an attuned and sensitive relationship. Then only thirdly, after doing these two things, can we reason. We can support the child to reflect, learn, remember, articulate, and become self-assured. Okay? That order. Regulate, relate, reason. And as you can see, you might have clicked on that this actually kind of mimics the brain. So if we think about the brainstem, the limbic system, and the cortex, so the regulation is the brainstem. Remember, that's the part of our brain that's responsible for breathing, for heart rate, for temperature. So we need to regulate them. We need to get control of their brainstem first. Then we relate. That was our emotional brain, our limbic system. So by connecting with them, we're allowing this area of the brain to calm down, to realize it's not under threat. And then once that has worked, once we have related, the thinking brain re-engages, then we can reason. Okay, there's no point trying to reason if we haven't related, because that thinking brain is not engaged. So it's really important to remember this upside down triangle. Think of it like the brain, that you have to start at the bottom and then work your way up. Only teach when the child is calm. They're not listening. You're only going to get frustrated if you're trying to intervene and reason when they still have their lids flipped. You are more likely to become dysregulated. Your stress will add to the child's stress. Save everybody in this situation. Regulate, relate, reason. Connection before correction. The third learning objective was to create classroom spaces that support regulation. You need to create sensory havens and teach children how to use the sensory tools before they are dysregulated. So identify which sensory items work for individuals I encourage you to do this for yourself as well. Things that I like, that I find calming, other people hate. So do not assume that the children will like everything that you like, or that they will like it because the other child liked it. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. So you need to find what works for each individual child, what smells they like, what smells calm them down, what type of music they like listening to, what kind of activities they like doing to calm them down, what they like running through their fingers. Some kids will love slime, others will hate slime. So you need to really experiment and find out what works for each individual child. Be aware of sensory overstimulation as well. If there is too much going on in the environment, it can lead to like a hyper-arousal. So you just have to be mindful that you can bamboozle a little bit. Build in intentional regulating activities through the day. So your rhythmic, patterned and repetitive activities are going to be the best. And those activities that hit more than one sense will be more effective at regulating. So like I said, if you're doing a Play-Doh activity, it's awesome. It's tactile. So they're getting that sense through their feel, like they're feeling it. You can add a smell. He suggested lavender because that tends to be a calming smell for most people. For me personally, it's not, but research has said for most people it is. And maybe while you're doing that, you can play some music in the background. Learning objective 4 was to develop the language to help children understand their big feelings. So sometimes the children will not really have any kind of understanding of why they are behaving the way they are. They can't articulate it. It's scary for them, the way that they're behaving and how they seem to be not in control of their brains. So you can actually teach them about their brain using the hand model and how they can tame their animal brain and re-engage their smart brain. I can't play this for you now, but I really recommend that you watch this video. It's incredible. The language that the woman uses to explain the brain, I think it's absolutely applicable for some of our older kids. And I encourage you to have a go at teaching your kids about it, not just your children that have experienced trauma, because all children flip their lids at some point, and it's quite incredible to see how children can grasp this concept. And it's really nice when they can articulate to you that, oh, I flipped my lid, and then you can talk about what kind of things can you do to get their lid back on, to how can they tame their animal brain, and start to use that language with them so that they can start to identify themselves and then start to learn how to use strategies for themselves. So supporting that self-regulation. And our 5th learning objective was to focus on the brain, not blame. Children who've experienced trauma have learned to exist in an unpredictable and often unsafe world. Their behaviour has allowed them to stay safe and alive. Okay, that's how you have to interpret their behaviour. Their brain has adapted in a way that is going to increase their chance of survival. They are not misbehaving to annoy you or to make your life difficult. They are hypersensitive to stress and do not know how to regulate themselves. The trauma compromises their development. We need to heal the brain. And you are the people who are working with these children for sometimes up to 8 hours a day. It's so important that you are doing everything that you can to help heal the brain. So I've just got a couple of take-home messages here. I know I've probably bamboozled you with a lot of information here, but the most important things to remember are that relationships are absolutely everything. That relational trauma is repaired through relationships. Is that you have a very important and powerful role in healing these children. The next point says that every interaction is an intervention. It has a little video that was filmed in the United States where we might disregard the impact that every single interaction has on a child, but the video shows what happens if if everybody takes that approach and everybody thinks, oh, it doesn't really matter, how that child can go through the whole day without really having a positive interaction with an adult. It's obviously quite an extreme example, but it's powerful nonetheless, so I encourage you to watch that video. The third really important take-home message is that you need to look after yourself. You're no good to anybody if you are dysregulated, so you need to actively plan to take care of your own mental health and think about what you would put in your own sensory toolkit. So what things help to regulate you when you're feeling dysregulated? How do you know when you're feeling very stressed? What does it feel like in your body? What does it look like? How would somebody else know if you're stressed? Because I think sometimes we often aren't very good at recognizing our own stress levels. So have a few mindful moments to identify your signs, your symptoms of being overwhelmed. And then you can start to put in place a plan to look after yourself. It's also, it's points not on the slide, but it's important to remember that vicarious trauma is very real. It's a very real phenomenon. If you were at the forefront of hearing the stories of children's trauma, so for most of our teaching staff this might not be the case, but our whānau support might hear some stories of significant trauma, and it does weigh on you. You can carry that with you, and you can actually become vicariously traumatized through someone else's trauma story. So please make sure that you are engaging in self-care and looking after yourself. And the final slide just has another link of a video to watch about how to talk with children about their big feelings and a bit more about the brain. Again, I recommend you watch it, really useful. And I know that I've given you a lot of information here, a lot of it very scientific, but please take the time to look through the slides again, to make sure that you've really understood the concepts, particularly about how you can intentionally plan regulatory activities, and just really understand the importance of your role in building relationships with our most vulnerable young children. Because if you remember back to the start of the presentation about the ACEs, is that what protects against adversity is relationships. Sometimes it might only take one significant relationship with an adult to protect against all of that adversity. So you can be the person that makes that huge difference in that child's entire life. So do not undervalue your role. Do not underestimate the importance of the relationship. The relationship is everything. I think it's a very privileged position to be in, that you're in, that you get to be the person sometimes in these children's lives that makes a difference, and wear that badge with pride and create those relationships mindfully. Good luck. I hope you enjoy applying some of these strategies, and I hope that you find it useful in your ongoing practice. I'll see you next time.